724/7, Sergio Chavez here again. Just coming back at you for a sermon recap that we just had this past Sabbath as we continue on our sermon series of Sermon on the Mount. We started on the Beatitudes in Matthew 5. We actually read the first three. Matthew 5:1-5, it says, in the CSV says, "And he, Yeshua, opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." We talked about some occupations within our history, within the world. No occupations really have gone great. Occupations tend to be a terrible thing in the world. We highlighted the occupation of Great Britain and India, and just how India went from being this powerhouse of world market to, after roughly 200 years of occupation by Britain, it fell down to the less than 3% of the world market trade. Basically, everybody who used to be skilled workers ended up being farmers and peasants, and India was just dove into poverty, and they were powerless to change it. It didn't, things didn't change until they finally declared their independence from Britain. But they went from people who were, self-sufficient, could trade with the world, could make their own money, to basically being under oppression. And very much like how here in Matthew, the Indians at that time were the powerless. They were the poor in spirit. They were the ones who were mourning. There was death all around them. They suffered through famines. So many people died. About 35 million people died during their time of occupation. And they were the meek. They were the powerless. And what we've been going through in the Sermon on the Mount is how Jesus opens up this sermon with these three things: the poor in spirit, those who mourn, and the meek. And this seems an interesting start to what Jesus is talking about, because as we established from last week, that Jesus is talking about the kingdom of heaven. That kingdom of heaven is near, meaning he is near. He is building the new kingdom of heaven. And he starts off with these traits, this blessed, these beatitudes that we talk about. And beatitudes is just a word for saying blessed. And so it's just a word that we gave it. He didn't say, hey, here's now the Beatitudes. He just started off with this sermon on this mount, which brings us to the other point of that the book of Matthew was written for a Jewish audience. And so there's this parallel. Why was Jesus on a mount? Why was it so important to be said that it was on a mount? Because scholars are kind of, they're sometimes, not sometimes, of like, is this the same sermon that's given in the book of Luke, where Jesus isn't on a mount? It just said he's on a plain. But again, Matthew knows who he's talking to. He's talking to Jews. He's not giving them any other option than to have to face the fact that Jesus is the Messiah. He's quoting Old Testament scripture. He keeps on bringing up prophecy. So Matthew is just leaving no leeway to say, I'm telling you that Jesus is the Messiah. And so there's this parallel here of Jesus being on a mount, where many other great things that have happened in scripture, where there's been some sort of connection with God, these great things are on mountains. Mount Sinai, where Moses gets the Ten Commandments. Elijah on a mountain, where he calls down fire from the sky. Abraham and Isaac was on a mountain. And so here yet again, we have this parallel that Matthew is giving people, that Jesus, who is God incarnate in the flesh, is now teaching on a mount. Again, knowing that he's talking to a Jewish audience. And so there's these interesting opening of those who are poor in spirit. What does that mean? When we look at the Beatitudes, scholars, some say that this was talking about a spiritual thing. Others saying it's a literal thing. I'm kind of saying that it's both. I think if we take the scripture as it is, Jesus is talking to people who are right in front of him, those who are poor in spirit. He's talking to people there who, we have to remember that the Jews at the time and those people were under Roman oppression, right? So they were in debt sometimes. They couldn't get themselves out of debt if they couldn't pay their taxes. And so there was people who were marginalized all the time. And Jesus is talking to them directly. And it's always interesting when people say, oh, well, Jesus doesn't stand with the marginalized. And what I would ask is, whoever's asking that, have them read Matthew 5 and ask them, then explain this. What is Jesus talking about? The only way you can say it is oh, well, he's kind of talking in future tense. Yes, I think we can learn from it, but I also think he's talking directly to the people that he's talking to. So he talks to the poor in spirit, to those who are poor, those who are not only material poor, but as well as like their life is just, it's very difficult. So their spirit is broken. Like when we say, "Oh, my spirit is troubled," like they are the poor in spirit. So therefore, they are at a place where they are only relying on God, and they need God in order to lift them up. And so we can take that beyond what's there in the text of Jesus just talking to the people there and say like, okay, so this could be applied if we talk in a spiritual sense to those who as well are poor in spirit, those who are troubled by what they see in the world, those who are troubled by the sin, either by the sin that they have themselves or by the sin that they see around them. Their spirit is troubled. They're poor in spirit. They're crying out to God. Oh, woe is me! Like I am so poor, in spirit. We have that in Scripture. We read that in Old Testament Scripture of other prophets who have said that, how poor am I? So it's more of a metaphor of how poor they are spiritually. So that's, we believe that Jesus is talking about there in poor in spirit. And then he goes to those who are mourning. And this, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. That, again, death is all around them. And those who are mourning the loss, their lost loved ones, and the life was pretty hard sometimes then. And so Jesus is saying, look, you will be comforted. Just like in Scripture we read later on in Revelations where when God comes again, he said, I will wipe away all tears, from those who've lost people. And as well, when we want to go past just the direct translation to the people he's talking to, we can go to as well to a more spiritual realm of those, we mourn the loss of things. I know as parents or as loved ones that you might have who have lost their way or losing their faith, you mourn the loss of that relation. You mourn the loss of them losing their faith, and you're crying out to God, please, God, help my wife or husband or uncle or kids or whatever it may be. And myself, I know I've sat with parents who their kids have, fallen away from faith or, have some sort of substance abuse and they're addicts or whatever, and they're just crying out. They're mourning for the loss of their child who's still alive. It's just that they're, everything that they're after is just not going towards God, and they may be even refusing God, and they're mourning that loss. So we can have it in the literal sense of those who Jesus is talking to, and in the spiritual sense of those who are mourning. And then last is the meek, the humble. Meek is not weak. Meek is, one have described it as humility under control, or power under control, which is humble, meek. And this is, again, those, when we look at what's going on in Christianity today, at least in the U.S., when we look at how Jesus was, like this kind of boisterous, this over the top, this enforcing, this kind of overbearing Christianity that you have to believe in this, you have to do it my way, you have to do it this, a specific way, or you are wrong, or whatever it may be, this kind of over the top, kind of overbearing, I don't want to call it evangelism because I don't think it's evangelism, but this forcefulness of what Christians should and shouldn't be and how it should happen. It's not here. God is saying, blessed are those who are meek, those who are humble. They will know. They know God. They will inherit the kingdom. Because those are the leaders we want to follow. Just as Jesus was. It says Jesus was meek and mild. So this goes along with the way Jesus was. And when we think of the people who Jesus hung out with, well, he hung out with the marginalized. He hung out with the prostitutes, the tax collectors. Tax collectors were not monetarily poor, but they were not well liked. They didn't have a lot of friends. We think of Zacchaeus, these things. So Jesus is pointing out that these are the people that I'm going to build my kingdom on. And then as we go on and read about Jesus, we realize those are the people he talks to, the woman at the well, those who are marginalized in that time. So Jesus just doesn't want these high, self-righteous, rich and powerful people. He's going to start building his kingdom with those who are at the bottom, essentially. And those are the ones who he's building his kingdom with, which makes sense because when we go later on in Matthew and in the other Gospels, when Jesus gives the parable of the vineyard owner who hires people, and there's some people who are working all day and then midday, and then there's people who are working just the very last moment, and then he pays them all the same, and the people who are working all day get all upset, like, hey, we've been working all day. Why is it you're paying them the same when we did so much of the work? And then he says in that, well, the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. again, you hear this same rhetoric or the same narrative from Jesus of saying, look, those who are the least will be the first in my kingdom. So the hope for us is that we see is that Jesus pays attention to the marginalized. In this, I feel like he's saying, look, I see your pain, I hear your pain, I know your pain, and I will build my kingdom on you because you are humble. You, later on, we'll hear about they're pure in heart. You are the people who rely on me only. And for us as Christians, the hope that we have today is that Jesus respects the marginalized, and as followers of Christ, we are called to do the same. Because when we do, that kingdom is near. A boisterous soul, one over the top, the one that has everything all figured out, they may not point you to God. But those who are humble, those who are meek, those who are poor in spirit, who only rely on God, they're the ones who we should follow. My name is Pedro Chavez.